right, hello everyone. This is going to be the lecture to cover the class for today, which is Wednesday, the 28th. For those of you who weren't there this morning, I usually get out of my chair to lecture, and I did have a little bit of a fall today, which doesn't usually happen. I'm fine. It's more inconvenient and frustrating than anything, but I decided for the sake of everyone's time, that we would just cancel class and I would post a recorded lecture. So here we are. So this lecture will be for Wednesday the 28th. I'm going to post a follow-up additional lecture that will cover what would be Friday's class, but obviously we meet online for Fridays. And then you're going to have a quiz that will cover the material from those two lectures. So make sure that you watch the lectures, read the material, and then take the quiz for this week. All right, so we're going to jump right in with chapter one, a scientific understanding of behavior. So this class is all about research methods. That is what we're going to be talking about all semester. We are bombarded with quote unquote research all of the time across pretty much any social media website, news outlet, even people walking around saying, well, I've done my research. And there's research on pretty much anything and everything that you could want to learn about from, how social media affects your mental health, the type of eating you should be doing, or adhere to research on whether or not you should own pets, and the list goes on and on. So you're constantly being exposed to claims that something may be either beneficial for you or possibly harmful to you, depending on what the research finds. And the question becomes, how do you actually evaluate these reports? How do you determine when you are finding a claim that is made or an article that was written, or a news media outlet that's making certain statements? How do you figure out if it's actually valid, if what is being presented to you is actually true and correct? So honing this skill of consuming research and critically evaluating any reports or findings that are based hopefully on scientific methods, that is the golden rule, right? That this will result in you being able to ultimately determine if these conclusions and ultimately the claims that people or articles are making, you can then determine if they're valid. So that is something that we are going to work on this semester, is teaching you how to be a critical consumer of research. That when you hear someone say, oh, I've done the research, or you see a research article, you will know by the end of this semester, hopefully, you'll understand and know how to critically evaluate those things from a scientific standpoint. So looking for data and facts and truth. Now, of course, another great reason to be educated or an educated consumer of research is that research is involved and impacts a lot of fields that you work in outside of the school setting. Ranging from the medical field, that's probably the most obvious and the one that people most typically think about when they think about research. But it spans all the way into the business world. So there are a lot of research that's being done, in certain companies and certain professions to, how do we improve our employees' satisfaction with the job or their, happiness and contentment at the office and so on and so forth. Typically, when we're looking at medical field research, the research that's being done is looking at different medications, different treatments for illnesses. Of course, vaccine research, which we have seen some research come out in the last few years that is good, and other that is maybe not so based on scientific method. That's something that you may come across and start to evaluate as we go through sort of the requirements or the standards that we have for research in this class. Mental health professionals as well also make numerous decisions relating to a client's treatment, different protocols that they're going to use, different types of therapies that they're going to expose their patients to. And all of these decisions, as far as treatment and therapy goes, should be and are based on research. Um, in order to actually apply the research that they're consuming, mental health professionals have to understand it. They have to be able to critically evaluate the findings, and then they have to be able to translate them to a real world application, which is actually helping their patients in the clinical realm or the clinical field. And many of you may go into mental health, right? You're in psychology, so there's a number of different routes that you can go. But a lot of people do go the way of mental health in some capacity. And so it's very important that you understand how to consume and evaluate research, because if you do go down that path, you're going to need to be able to successfully look at research in order to guide your therapy practices. And then, as I mentioned, there's also a lot of research being done in the business realm. A lot of business decisions that are made in terms of employee satisfaction, different training methods that are used, marketing strategies that these companies utilize, how they select new employees, how they can determine if someone's going to make a good fit employee versus someone who maybe is not the best fit. Again, this all depends on that business's ability to consume the research that is coming out in that field and then apply it in a real world application, which is actually to employees in their company. Another interesting one to look at research on is dating apps. So, a lot of research has been done with these companies on things like people's different behaviors when they are dating or when they're getting to know someone that they have a romantic preference to. They look at things like level of interactions. And of course, they're always trying to evaluate how do we increase that, right? How do we get more users? How do we get users to stay in the app and continue with that interaction? Looking at how matches are made, and so on and so forth. And in the dating app world, most of those companies, I would say probably all of those companies, they actually have an entire department that is behavioral research because they need that research to be produced for findings so that they can use those to then fuel the different practices they're putting into play on the actual app, which then the consumer uses and hopefully uses, over and over again, unless they find someone. But if you're single, the idea is that you'll come back to this app, that we've made it so successful or we've made it a good enough app for you that you will come back and use it. And all of those decisions that are made are being done through research and the findings that come out of that. Now, something else I think that is really important to talk about is we do see the effect that research can have with regard to public policy. So, this is looking at how decisions might be made regarding new or existing policies. I think right now it is glaringly obvious that research is not being used correctly to guide the policies that are being made. And it is only exasperating and showing how necessary good research is. Sound research done from the scientific method and standard, that those are necessary when we are looking at public policies, what we're going to put forth in the different policy decisions that we are making. So there's many examples that we can look at too, historically with regard to legislation and policies that are put in place because of findings that came out of research. So, for example, and I know that the book touches on this as well, but there was a Supreme Court decision many years ago stating that juveniles that are found guilty of a crime cannot be punished with the death penalty. And so the way this decision came about, it wasn't just, someone thought, oh, maybe we shouldn't give, juveniles punished with the death penalty. Maybe that's something we shouldn't do. A series of actual behavioral and neurological research studies were being done on this demographic. So on teens in general, and then also teens or juveniles that have committed crimes. And all of these research studies that were done, both on the behavioral side, which is looking at outward behaviors that these individuals are engaging in, and the neurological research. So they're looking at the biological components, right? Your brain activity and things like that. All of those studies combined came out with overwhelming evidence and proof that adolescent brains, their social relationships, their overall character, it's not fully developed when it is compared to the behavior and neurological functioning of adults. So when we look at juveniles versus adults, there's a very clear difference according to this research, and all of the research confirms this. And so because of that, research that was presented when the policies were also presented and the laws were, being voted on, a new policy was then put in place to basically state we understand that juveniles functioning, their brain, they're not fully developed until they're adults, and we should not be holding them to the same standard as an adult, even when crimes are committed. So even when a new policy is put in place too, often research will be done to evaluate the effects of policy. So it does happen sort of the backwards way sometimes too, where the policy is put in place first and then they do the research. Not ideal. But it's good and it is necessary because if we are putting policies in place without research, at least then evaluate if it's helping or doing what the policy was set up to do. Like essentially, we're going to do research after to evaluate the effects of that policy. So we're looking at possible overall impact that the policy has on individuals in the community, society as a whole, maybe the economy that it might be impacting, and so on and so forth. So all of these things can then be investigated and analyzed after that policy is put in place. And then, of course, we have research that just allows us to answer applicable real world problems or questions, probably questions that are pretty close to the things that got you interested in psychology in the first place. So got you interested in wanting to learn more about this field. Things like, why do some students procrastinate while other students get everything done early? Why can some students juggle 6+ classes and other students can handle 2 classes and that's good for them? Why do some people get really overwhelmed in hard, difficult, stressful situations, maybe resulting in anxiety or depression, while others maybe are not as deeply affected by a similar stressful or hard situation? Looking at different experiences that you have in your childhood. And even if they're similar to someone else's, they may affect you differently as an adult than it affects them. And on and on and on. So we can look at any number of real world sort of applicable problems or questions that we might have in terms of research and the questions that we're going to ask. And we are going to be talking about this a lot in this unit too, because your first writing assignment has to do with this, has to do with developing a research question. And a lot of those questions that just make you curious or make you ask, why? Why is that happening? I'm wondering what affects that. Those are usually great questions to fuel research. And science, more specifically behavioral science, which is what we are doing in psychology research, is ultimately the best way to explore these sort of real world research questions that we have. Okay, so before we get into the scientific method and how we develop research, let's talk a little bit about how we view science. Okay, so how we're going to talk about science in this class, how we talk about science in the field of psychology, most other medical fields, and so on. So there is really no universal term or definition, but rather science represents a systematic approach that we take whenever we're trying to understand, for us, human behavior. For other areas of study, it's some other phenomena, right? For chemistry, you're looking at trying to understand and take a systematic approach to chemistry and chemical reactions and so on and so forth. So depending on what you're studying, is going to determine, what we're trying to look at, what we're trying to understand. Of course, in this class, we're studying human behavior. But I think the most important takeaway from this is science should have a systematic approach whenever you're trying to understand what it is you're studying. So systematic means that it is the same for everyone, and there are standards that have to be met when you are conducting research in order for it to be considered valid. So even though there isn't a universal definition of science, there are some core characteristics that we want to make sure we understand. So first, science really allows us to provide accurate descriptions of observed events of some kind. Now, in the realm of psychology, it allows us to predict with various degrees of accuracy, so we can get pretty accurate, how organisms are going to behave under certain conditions. What this is saying is we can predict and we can even change and control the behaviors that individuals or organisms will engage in under specific conditions. Um, and when we understand why events occur, why behaviors happen, it does provide us a certain level of control. Now, control is not necessarily a bad word. Sometimes, when you hear the word, oh, we're going to control your behavior, right? That doesn't necessarily make you super thrilled, but the way in which we use that term control in a scientific sense is slightly different than how we think of it in sort of everyday language. So let's give an example of this. Let's say that you decide you want to look at, your research question is looking at increasing the amount of exercise that somebody does. And even if you were going to do this for your own personal interest, so let's say you just want to do some research on yourself, right? And you're like, I want to increase the amount of exercise I do. Well, first you need to start with tracking it. You need to find out how much exercise you're actually doing now before we implement any type of treatment or protocol. And let's say you find out you actually do very little exercise. So you're not going very regularly, you're not going with any type of consistency, and it's not as much as you would like it to be. So what you're going to do is you're going to start reinforcing your behavior in some way every time you exercise. So let's say, every time I exercise, um, let's say you're only going to watch an episode of your favorite show if you exercised first that day, whatever that may look like. Maybe you go to the gym or maybe you just do some exercise at home. But you only get to watch an episode of that show, right? You only get the reinforcer, you only get the reward if you engage in the behavior first. And if you consistently do that every single time, where you're reinforcing the behavior with some positive outcome, positive consequence after the behavior, what we see and what we know is that the behavior will increase over time. And most likely, your exercising behavior will increase because you are trying to access that reinforcer, whatever it is that you've set up for yourself to receive after you've exercised. Now, of course, with things like that, it does need to be something that's valuable to you, right? If it's something that you don't really enjoy, then exercising, you might just kind of be like, well, I don't really care if I don't watch that show today. It's not that big of a deal. I'm not going to exercise. I had a friend of mine who really wanted to increase her exercise when we were in grad school, surviving on caffeine in those days. And she loved Starbucks, as many people do. And this was many years ago, so it was a lot less expensive than it is today. But she would go to Starbucks almost every day. I would say like pretty close to every single day. But she really wanted to have sort of a better grad school slash real life balance because we weren't very good at doing that in grad school. It's pretty stressful. So she says, okay, I'm gonna exercise more often, but I'm not allowed to go to Starbucks unless I exercise first. Now for other people, that might not be that big of a deal, right? I make my coffee at home. If someone says you can't go to Starbucks anymore, I'm like, oh, that's fine. I don't go to Starbucks anyways. But for her, this was something she really enjoyed. It was something she looked forward to every single day, and it kind of got her up and going and getting through the day. So if she couldn't have her Starbucks, if she couldn't go and get her favorite drink every day before our grad class started in the morning, then she was not going to be a happy camper. So she would exercise usually the evening before, and if she actually did it, then the next morning she could get Starbucks. And what we saw was she actually started exercising more often and with less resistance. So she would just do it. It became part of her habit because she was reinforcing that behavior with something that was really powerful for her, right? It was a meaningful reinforcer that she actually wanted. Now, what happens when we do this? When we are able to increase behavior over time, you've actually achieved some degree of control over this behavior, which is a good thing, right? If we're trying to increase certain good behaviors, or maybe you're trying to decrease certain negative behaviors. Either way you look at it, once you have achieved some degree of control over that behavior, that you can make it occur more often or make it occur less often, that is a good thing, right? That is how ultimately we teach people how to engage in certain behaviors, certain habits, different routines, and so on and so forth. So, another core characteristic is something called determinism. So, determinism is a philosophical position that events do not just occur at random. Now, there are other philosophical positions, but in this class, we are going to assume that determinism is accurate and correct. And it has been shown to be that way. So I'm not just saying we're just going to think that. There's lots of research on determinism and why we believe this is something that occurs in behavioral research. And I'll give you an example of, just a simple example of why we see this and we do see it play out in research. If your behavior was not determined, so what that means is maybe it was accidental. So accidentalism is another philosophical positions where events occur by accident or without cause. Um, if that were true, if that were to be the case, which what we're basically saying is you could engage in any single behavior that you want to engage in at any time, and we have no way of predicting what you're going to engage in. Okay. It's also known as free will, right? If that were true, if free will was truly a thing in that concept where you could engage in any behavior you want to at any point in time, and we could never predict what you're going to do next, then we couldn't study human behavior. It would be impossible to study human behavior because we can't account for every single behavior that any person could ever engage in at any point in time, right? That's not realistic. And if truly there was no predictability to your behavior and it was all by chance and it's all accidental, then what are we even studying? We would not be able to study human behavior. So, um, sorry to burst your bubble, but free will in that sense is not actually a thing. Your behavior is determined. And I will give you an example of this, okay? Let's say we're sitting in the classroom, I'm lecturing to you, and there are a lot of different behaviors that technically speaking, you could engage in, right? You could, technically speaking, if you're physically capable of doing so, you could stand up on your desk and start singing and start dancing around on the desk. All right. That is something you could do. And if you had true 100% free will, that would be just as possible, 100% possibility, as it would be 100% possible that you could sit in your chair or 100% possible that you could sit on the floor, right? There's no predictability if that were true. But we know that's not true. Behavior is determined. I can predict with probably 100% accuracy that nobody in my class, and nobody ever has, nobody in my class is going to walk in, stand up on the desk, and start singing and dancing. Why? Because the environment is actually controlling your behavior. You have learned from a very young age what is and what is not acceptable in terms of your behavior in a classroom setting. Now, when you were 3 in preschool, you maybe did stand on a table and dance around and sing. And you were probably reprimanded for that. You were probably told to get down. That's not safe. That's not what we do in the classroom. We're learning right now. We're reading a book right now. We're doing group time right now, right? Your behavior was shaped in a different way. So you learned over time, okay, well, in this context, in this environment of a classroom, the behavior of standing on a table and dancing is not allowed. Now, if you're in a different environment or context, let's say you go to a club or a bar where they encourage that, right? Now that behavior is reinforced in that setting. And so I can predict more accurately that when you're in the setting of a classroom, you're not going to engage in that behavior. You're going to engage in a bunch of other behaviors you've learned, right? You'll sit in the desk, you'll pull your computer out, you'll listen to the lecture, you'll take notes, and so on and so forth. Those behaviors are fairly predictable. Same thing if we look at your behaviors in a bar or a club. Again, those behaviors have been shaped and controlled by the environment that you are existing in. And so we can predict with some accuracy, pretty high accuracy, which behaviors you'll engage in and which behaviors you will not. Like I can predict fairly accurately that you're not going to sit on the floor of a club where everyone is dancing. Now, that might happen if you're intoxicated or something, but by choice, you're not necessarily going to sit on the floor at a bar or at a club, right? So that's what we mean when we talk about determinism. Your behavior is determined based on the different behaviors that you've engaged in the past in that setting and whether or not that behavior was reinforced or punished. Now, another core characteristic of science is something we called empirical evidence or reliance on empirical evidence. So this is where we gather information about natural phenomena through experimentation and observation. We do not gather information based on hearsay, so because so and so said so and so told them, or intuition, or a feeling that I have, or just my own opinion, right? That's not empirical evidence. That's not what we base our decisions and our treatment recommendations and the protocols that we use. We are not basing those things on a feeling or on an intuition. That would be terribly unethical to our patients to do so. What we're actually looking for is the information that is gathered based on controlled experimentation and observation of the behavior in the research setting. So in this class and in science, as we think of it in our field, we rely on that empirical evidence to guide any of the decisions that we're going to be making. And then finally, we have replication. So replication is really important. This is when experiments and procedures are replicated to ensure their validity and their reliability of the results and procedures. Now, we're going to get into what validity is and what reliability is, but it's basically looking at are we actually measuring what we set out to measure? And do we get the same results every time? That's what replication is looking at. So if you conduct a study in your lab and you get some amazing findings and you're like, okay, cool. This really shows what we were looking for and what we expected to see. And this is amazing. And this is really good data. And that's exciting. However, if it's the first study and the only study that has ever gotten those results, it needs to be replicated first before you can make any substantial claims in terms of your findings. So you will see oftentimes in research articles, and we are going to be reading them this semester, you will often see in the discussion where they're very careful how they phrase their findings, okay? They don't come out and say, oh, this is the reason and this is what is causing this, and we are 100% sure. Now, you are not seeing that right now. in our world, okay? You are seeing right now in our world where a few studies are conducted, a little bit of research is done, and then everyone comes out and says, okay, that's the finding, that's the result. A very good example of this was the research that came out of the White House with regards to autism and acetaminophen, okay? And those research studies did not go on for very long, and they have yet to be replicated with the same findings in any other lab outside of the labs that are within the White House scientific community. That's not great, okay? We as scientists want our studies to be replicated. The goal is that other scientists will do the same research question, the same research methodology that we use, and hopefully they get the same findings. Because the more studies you have that confirm the findings over and over and over again from different labs, okay, that is important. They shouldn't all be coming out of one lab. If you're reading a line of research and they have these phenomenal outcomes that give them like 100% sure answer and they're confident in their findings, but you cannot find any other study that's coming out of any other lab, that's a red flag as far as research goes, okay? So when we are talking about replication, that's what we're talking about. It should be replicated by other scientists in other labs, and you should be getting similar or same results. Once that is happening, you can be a little bit more confident in your findings and your results because you're not the only one that's getting them, right? And science is a predictable thing. If it is true, if what you did was accurate and sound and the results are true, someone else should be able to replicate and show that. If you have not done your research from a core principle of the scientific method, which we're going to go through in just a moment, of sort of those standards that we have, then what you run into is you get one finding and someone else tries to replicate your study and they get a completely different finding. And that is not sound, valid, reliable research. And we would say that those results are, weak at best. All right. So I've mentioned it a little bit already, but we do use the scientific method to approach the questions that we ask about human behavior and any other phenomena that we are interested in investigating. So this is what we use. Essentially, it is the guide. It's the set of rules that all scientists follow in their given field, their given study, their given phenomena that they're looking at. Because as long as we all have the same measuring stick, right? We're all using the same measurement, we're all using the same rules to guide our research, then we know our investigations are going to be systematic and have some level of control so that you can then say, my findings are accurate, my findings are valid, right? That is the goal. And we can only do that if we're all coming from the same place, okay? You cannot start research from completely different spots or using a completely different measurement than the rest of the scientific community. It has to be the same. It has to be systematic in order for it to be valid. So there are several steps here. The first step, of course, is identifying your question of interest. So deciding what is it exactly that you're going to investigate, and making sure that you state that specifically. Like, this is what we're looking at. This is our research question. Now, from that question directly, you're going to formulate some sort of explanation. This is going to be your theory or your hypothesis. It's what you think is going to happen. It's the answer that you think you're going to get to the question that you're asking. Okay, so you're going to formulate that explanation, that hypothesis. You can even get a little bit more specific, and we'll go into this a little bit later on, but you can get more specific and have a prediction of what you're going to see in your research question. So let's say if you're asking, does gender identity affect social media usage? Okay, so what we're looking at is, do the different gender identities then result in different amount of time that social media is used or utilized? Okay, so that's the overall research question. Now you can get more specific and you can say those that identify as this gender are going to have a higher use of social media than those who identify as this gender, right? So you can make a very specific hypothesis and prediction about what you think you're going to find. So that's all encompassed within the explanation or formulating your explanation. Now, once you have that, then you carry out the research. So to actually do this correctly, you should be trying to prove your hypothesis wrong. Okay, that sounds counterintuitive, but you never ever want to develop a hypothesis or a prediction and then carry out research or search for and try to find data that proves you right. Why wouldn't you want to do this? Because it introduces a significant amount of bias when you do that. If you are trying to prove yourself correct, right? You got a horse in the race, right? You want your hypothesis and your prediction to be right. And then if you're looking for it to be right, you're probably going to find something that at least supports what you're saying as correct. And then you run with it. You're like, see, I was right. Bias is introduced. It comes into play, it skews the data. And this has been shown to happen in many instances, right? If there is any kind of money involved, that can skew the data, right? That can skew the results because someone is invested in the results coming out a certain way. Because if they come out a certain way, then they get paid for it. I think a good thing to look at in research is money. We as researchers do not make money. We don't get paid. I have many published papers. I didn't receive a dime for a single one. That's not why we do research. And if someone is doing research purely to get paid, there may be some bias there. Not always, but probably. Why? Because they are trying to prove themselves correct so that they can get access to that money. So what we actually do is we try to prove ourselves wrong. We actually try to prove the opposite correct. Okay, what we think is going to happen, we're going to try and prove the opposite. And if we still get findings that prove us right, we know, okay, we haven't introduced any bias. I was actually trying to prove myself wrong, but I in fact proved myself right. So these results most likely are valid and reliable. And then finally, we communicate our findings. So this is where we relay to the scientific community, what we did. What is it that what we did? What did we find? How did we do this? So this is when we publish the paper. Okay, you publish the paper, it gets out to the scientific community so that they can evaluate your findings and maybe replicate the study and see if they can get the same findings as well. So let's go into just a little bit more on each of these steps, a little bit more in depth. So looking at your question of interest, that's the first step. That's also the first assignment that you're going to be completing in this class. You're going to be developing a research question or question of interest. So one great way to find questions, if you are drawing a blank when you go to do this for your assignment and you're like, I don't know what to ask, just observe people. And because we focus on human behavior, so you can just do some people watching. Sit on a bench on campus for 15 minutes, watch people walk around, and anything that kind of makes you go, huh, that's weird. Why would someone do that? Or why were they engaging in that behavior just now? Or why were they behaving that way? Any questions that make you sort of curious usually and often lead to new research questions. They lead you to asking why and how can I research that? How can I find out the answer to my question? Once you've done that, you can also, and you should also turn to literature, which we're going to do. I'm going to talk about how you do that a little bit later on in this unit. But you need to make sure no one else has already asked the exact same question as you that you want to investigate. Now, for your guys' assignment, I'm going to allow you to ask questions that probably have already been answered, but that's okay. Because you're just learning, right? And this is for practice. But in general, when you're actually conducting scientific research, one of the biggest things that we have to make sure of is that we're not just doing what somebody else already did, unless the research is very small and we're trying to replicate it. And in that case, we have to state that. We have to say, we are doing either a direct replication of this study, which basically means we're doing exactly what they did to try and find the same results, or you might do a systematic replication, which means we're doing mostly what they did, but we're changing one small thing to see if that small change gives us different results. So whenever we're doing any type of research project, and we did this all the time in my research lab in grad school for my thesis, I had to do a lot of research in the literature to make sure that what I was doing was not exactly what someone else had already done and something that had already been replicated and doesn't need to be replicated anymore. The second step, formulating that explanation or the question of interest. It's your hypothesis and your theory and your prediction. So let's go through these. So the first part of this is going to include the theory. This is a broad explanation referring to the phenomenon that you're investigating. It's the overarching big picture. Okay, so this is where we don't get into any specifics. It's just a very broad view of the research question. So the example I gave you earlier, does gender identity result in different amounts of social media use, right? Or you could even go more broad in general than that. You could say, does gender identity impact social media usage? Okay, so that's very broad. We're not getting into any specifics yet. We're not making any predictions. We're not making any assumptions. We're just saying, overall, is social media usage affected by this other thing? Another example of this might be, do electronic devices impact our relationships with others? So again, this is very broad in general, right? We're not stating specifically what electronic devices, we're not stating what kind of use, we're not stating what type of relationships we're looking at. We're just saying, in general, do electronic devices impact our relationships with other people? So that's what a theory is. It's very broad in general. You are going to have to state that. Okay, that's part of your research question. That's part of the assignment. So you'll have a broad general explanation, which is your theory on the research question that you're asking. So always notice with a theory, we're not specifying anything. You're not specifying what the behavior is. You're not specifying what the gender is. You're not specifying what's being used for reinforcement or how much social media is being used. It's just those broad general statements. Then you can get more specific with your prediction or your hypothesis. So the hypothesis is the prediction that comes directly from the theory. And this includes specifics that can be used and then tested. So the goal of a hypothesis is showing, if this happens, if A happens, then we expect to see this. We expect to see B, right? So this is where you get more specific. So if we took the theory of, do electronic devices impact relationships with others, I'm going to get more specific. So that's the research question. The theory would be, yes, electronic devices impact our relationships. So we're making a statement that yes, there is an impact, but we're not giving any kind of specifics yet. Then we get a little bit more specific. The use of smartphones in the home negatively impacts the parent-child relationship. Okay, so now we're getting very specific with our hypothesis, right? We've basically stated smartphones only. Okay, we're not looking at televisions, we're not looking at music, we're not looking at tablets, we're not looking at video games, we're looking at smartphones that are being used in the home. And we're looking specifically at the parent-child relationship. So we're not looking at sibling relationship, we're not looking at parent-parent relationship, we're looking at parent-child relationships and how are those impacted. So if our hypothesis, the use of smartphones in the home negatively impacts parent-child relationship, what are we expecting to see? Well, we expect to see, so this is your prediction. So your hypothesis, or let's go back. Your theory was the electronic devices impact relationships with others. Okay, that came from the question, do electronic devices impact relationships? You're answering yes. Electronic devices do impact our relationships. Then you go into your hypothesis. The use of smartphones in the home negatively impacts the parent-child relationship. That's the hypothesis. We got more specific. Now your prediction, which comes straight from your hypothesis. We predict to see that there will be a decreased quality of parent-child relationship in the home when smartphones are used. And as smartphones are used more often, the quality of parent-child relationship will then decrease even more, right? So we're making very specific predictions from our hypothesis. Let's see. Another example of this would be, does cell phone usage affect our driving? Okay, that's a research question. Does using your cell phone affect your driving? So when you're driving, right? Here's the theory. People using cell phones get in car accidents. Like that's a very broad general statement. People talking on their cell phones result in car accidents. So maybe we're going to investigate this theory further. We're going to develop a hypothesis. Hypothesis would be, if people are on their phones, we expect to see a car accident. So the prediction is the more often someone is on their phone while driving, the more likely they are to get in a car accident. So see how we go from very general, right, very broad with our theory, and we get more and more specific every time we go from the question to the theory to the hypothesis to the prediction. And that's exactly what you're going to be doing in your first writing assignment. So I'll be posting a separate lecture for that, going over the specifics of that. But just so you know, just so you're aware, kind of put it on your radar. That is exactly what you're going to be doing for assignment number 1. All right, I'm going to stop the lecture here for the first lecture. We'll pick back up for the second lecture on the next slide.